Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson. Welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I'm your host, as always. I am delighted today to be joined by Garrett Graff, writer, podcaster, smart guy, now the publisher of the Doomsday Scenario newsletter. I love talking to Garrett because he is a guy who dives so deep into a subject, whether it's guns or UFOs or national security or history. And really, or especially his recent book about When the Sea Came Alive, this beautiful oral history of World War II, or the Normandy era of World War II. But Garrett is always a brilliant conversationalist. Really understands the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. So, Garrett, welcome to the podcast, and thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me again.
So I want to start out with Doomsday Scenario. Talk to us about this newsletter and talk to us about what your intentions on it are, where people can find it, etc.
I think one of the things in this Trump era that is so challenging is really making sense of all of the things that are transpiring every single day. And so the thing that I have been trying to do for the last couple of weeks, which is what you and I were emailing about originally, is on Saturdays, writing a weekly news roundup that features the news as the U.S. media would cover it if it was being reported in a foreign country. Because I think one of the challenges of our media right now is most of the mainstream media is not sounding the alarm at the level the alarm needs to be sounded. And that's because we are coming at it with this history of American exceptionalism, sort of thinking that we are different than the rest of the world in a lot of these political trends and developments. And because we're sort of used to an American history where everything works out for the good guys over some period of time. And that what I think we are living through right now is something that most of the rest of the world is much more used to, which is, deep political instability, civil unrest, and for all intents and purposes, an authoritarian coup. And that if U.S. reporters were covering the developments that we are seeing in the U.S. right now in some foreign capital where they felt that they could be a little bit more swashbuckling and authoritative and didn't have to sort of namby-pamby their way through both sides' coverage, they would be much more clear-eyed about what was happening. So I've been trying to write now, I just did sort of the third week installment of, covering Elon Musk and Donald Trump in the way that we would cover it if it was happening overseas. And that's, being very clear that Elon Musk has established himself as a unchallenged head of government, that we have a ceremonial head of state in Donald Trump, that Elon Musk's junta have seized key government ministries like the National Treasury, and that, we're seeing political purges in the security services. And again, sort of every one of these phrases sort of feels like the type of thing that we read all of the time in other countries' coverage, those rare times where we bother covering the rest of the world at all. But that we right now are, I think, having a hard time recognizing this because we just don't have the permission structure to even really understand these developments as they are taking place in the United States.
the analogy of a straightforward sort of like the literary or the actual cliched sort of third world coup, say circa 1949 to 1999.
Yep.
The rebel forces seize the airfield, the treasury, the secret police, and then they take the
Yep.
palace. And I think your distinction of Trump as a head of state versus Elon as head of government is very sharp, and that's one of the things that the American experiment always combine those two roles in the presidency. But I still keep wondering, is there going to be a tension at some point where Susie Wiles and the rest of the normies, try to draw a line? I know they've been trying sort of in the old-fashioned way of leaking things. Elon's in the bad list, but it doesn't seem to be working for Team Normal, whatever small faction of Trump's of administration that might represent.
Yeah, and I think you surely understand the internal dynamics of the Trump White House better than I do, but my impression is there just aren't enough of those people left, and
right.
that in the first Trump administration, there was a very strong Team Normal. There were cabinet secretaries. There were
Mattis,
right.
Cohn,
There
Tillerson,
were White House chiefs of staff. There were national security advisors. That there were sort of people inside the White House who, understood the structures of government. And right now, I don't think that those people exist in any large numbers and have no meaningful power even when they do exist. And, I think part of the challenge with Elon Musk is he is not someone who appears in any way beholden to the normal power structures that Washington operates on. This is not someone who has, is super worried about his next primary. This is not someone who is super worried about, the fundraising backlash that he's getting, when he's dialing for dollars with Wall Street executives in the afternoon in the way a member of Congress is. This is someone who there are no meaningful checks and balances on in American life. And in fact, someone who has come to the position that he is in today, basically because America has never held him meaningfully responsible for any of his law-breaking or transgressions until now. I have thought for a decade, and you and I have talked about this in the past, that sort of the entire Trump era is a lesson in what happens when you under-prosecute white-collar crime. That,
absolutely,
if you look back at the first Trump administration, if we had sort of aggressively prosecuted white-collar crime in the early 2000s, Paul Manafort's not there, Michael Cohen's not there, Donald Trump's not there, none of the Donald Trump kids are there. And now we have an Elon Musk, this guy who has, on a weekly, if not monthly basis for most of the, last 5 or 10 years, been a walking SEC violation.
God.
He, that sort of the U.S., 3 years later hits him with a $25,000 fine for. And I think he's sort of a great example of the extreme version of, if the only punishment is a fine, then it's only a crime for poor people. That, that Elon Musk is in a position where, what are we going to do to him?
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. And I mean, Elon's violating SEC stuff constantly. An interesting person today, a Silicon Valley person, said to me today, I was sort of like, you guys, you other billionaires have to get off the mat. You guys can't keep letting him run roughshod. I said, at the end of the day, he'll destroy your companies. You know what he's going to do. And he said, it was funny because he brought up the same thing. He goes, He goes, there's not any tools in the toolbox anymore for us to do that. He goes, we're going to stop him from buying OpenAI, maybe. But what happens when Trump says to Sam Altman, you either sell to Elon or bad things will happen to you? That's not an unlikely scenario at this point. And but it's funny you mentioned white collar crime, because my friend said, look, a lot of guys in the Valley took a big lesson in 2008, 9, and 10, because nobody on Wall Street got in trouble. Nobody on Wall Street had the slightest repercussion. One guy had a trivial fine. And the Valley and the money guys in the Valley, of which Elon is more of a money guy than a technology guy, as we know, learned that lesson. And they realized government and the courts are essentially powerless to harm them financially at a level that would change their outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that's really fascinating to me in watching the dynamics play out is, we had this press conference last week, which was a big chunk of the write-up I did on Saturday, where, it is clear that there is this bizarre power-sharing agreement that we have never seen before in American politics. But does anyone look at, Elon Musk holding court next to the Resolute desk in the Oval Office while Donald Trump sits in near total silence, and think Donald Trump is meaningfully in control of anything in Washington right now? No, this is, and again, if we saw this happening in a different country, and we saw, Elon Musk's mercenaries sort of pulled from his sprawling business empire and descending on the Capitol to seize government ministries and take over government communication networks, and intimidate federal workers, we would know what to call that. And there's sort of this weird, there's this weird, two-step that I think the DC media is still caught in, of DOGE is an official real thing in the federal government. No, it's not. It's
not. It's a contrivance to give this guy a fig leaf of legitimacy for the most illegitimate possible actions.
Absolutely. This is a junta, and this is a coup, and we just can't quite wrap our heads around that in the way that that we sort of are well, Donald Trump's still in charge. He's still the president.
Is he though? I think that's one thing that Trump's lack of engagement in that press conference in the Oval Office struck me, and I think it probably had to strike even some of his fans, of just how commanding Elon was in that room. Trump was, okay, listen, sit quietly and you get your pudding in a half an hour. This was not the Donald Trump that people knew, of his fan base, that they knew in 2016 or 2020. I mean, certainly not the guy from 2016. But he's so passive and deferential, and I don't think, by the way, I don't know, I want to ask your opinion about this. I am not a believer in the theory that Trump knows what Elon's doing and he's perfectly good with it because it takes stress and pain away from him. I think that's BS. I think Trump has almost no understanding of what Musk is up to. I think he technically and logistically and politically does not understand what's happening around him.
I think that's absolutely right. And again, I think the model that people need to be thinking about this is Elon Musk is out there running government, and Donald Trump is the sort of ceremonial figurehead, head of state, sitting in the Oval Office, completely and totally focused on this incredibly weird set of personal obsessions. I mean, if you sort of look back over the last couple of weeks, what you see is no sign that Donald Trump is focused on running government or even aware of what is happening in government. He's sitting there sort of, making these pronouncements that the U.S. is going to take over Gaza. He's there outlawing.
It's going to work out great. Greeted as liberators.
Right. He's signing these executive orders focused on, transgender, barring transgender athletes in the United States, which literally counts for 10 people out of 500,000. Last week, how much energy did the White House put to the Gulf of America versus the Gulf of Mexico? I saw sort of more energy and attention at the White House on that issue than I did on any other issue, foreign or domestic. And I think to sort of in some ways, Donald Trump is sort of trending towards this sort of senile Truman Show character where he gets to sit in the Oval Office while Elon Musk runs government, and he gets to sort of sign his fancy papers and hold bombastic press conferences that people take sort of seriously and literally now, but also aren't necessarily even going to go anywhere.
The weekend, I think, was a great example of that, Garrett. And Trump does still have a desire to be the center of the spectacle. And so he goes to Daytona, they fly Air Force One, they circle the field with Air Force One, they race the beast around the track a few times. While he was doing that, Elon's people were trying to beat down the doors at the IRS to get inside the most sensitive IRS system, the one that not only contains every taxpayer record, but that also issues IRS violations, collections, refunds, etc. And I think Washington's got a failure mode. Washington journalism, particularly, has a failure mode where they are still chasing the spectacle. Oh no, we have to cover Trump going to Daytona, and so the machine moves with the president. And I know the White House press package is a different beast than a lot of things, but it struck me yesterday like the amount of coverage of Trump and analyzing, why does Trump go to NASCAR events? We know why. It just strikes me that the culture change in Washington that should have happened after 2016 and never did, and should have happened after January 6th and never did. And once again, it's like I wake up thinking some days like, as many mistakes as I've made in my life, I've never made a mistake like American journalists make in misunderstanding the threat of Trump.
And I would go one step further than that and say, coming back to this Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America insanity, what you saw last week with the showdown between the White House and the Associated Press, I was really shocked, perhaps not surprised, but horrified by the lack of solidarity of the other journalists in the White House press corps who failed to stand up to Donald Trump, to the White House, for the Associated Press. This is sort of one of those, like, they're starting with the Associated Press. Every one of those organizations is going to face a pressure campaign at some point. And the fact
you wrote something critical about Donald Trump, you said something bad about Elon Musk, you can't go on the plane.
Exactly. And so for me, the thing that I think actually would have been best of all is all of the rest of them just stop showing up until the Associated Press is let back on. To your point about Donald Trump is in it for the spectacle, the fastest possible way to get Donald Trump to cave on punishing the Associated Press is for people to stop knowing that the spectacle is happening at all. And, I'm sure the journalists in the press corps are sitting there saying, well, if we don't show up, then, Daily Caller and Breitbart are going to get our seats on the plane.
Blah, blah. Right.
Guys, he's going to do that to you anyway.
Well, yeah, take a look at the Pentagon. What has he done?
Exactly.
He has stacked the deck there with all lunatic fringe, MAGA, weirdo media types. There's no, the punishment they worry about in the short term, to my mind, is a real failure of recognition of risk, because that short-term punishment, the major punishment at the end will be that he's going to start licensing media, and he's going to say the First Amendment's optional. Hey, I changed the 14th Amendment, I can change the First. And I think journalists have underscored that risk, undercounted that risk from the very start of Trump, way back in 2015.
Yeah. I think we have always known where this story was going. And there is a reason, again, going to the foreign examples versus the US example, there's a reason that most countries, once someone launches a coup, they're not allowed back into a democracy's politics. And, they are punished and jailed and incarcerated.
Exiled, what have you. Yeah.
And, I think that to me, everything that we are living through right now was in some ways inevitable the day that Donald Trump won. And it was inevitable the moment, he was not held accountable over the course of 2024 for, his various transgressions against the democratic system. And yet it is still worse and more dangerous than I had imagined it was going to be. And I would, you talk about, DOGE the DOGE junta breaking into the IRS. The other thing we saw over the course of this weekend was the DOGE mercenary junta firing the nation's nuclear weapon security professionals because they literally did not understand what the National Nuclear Security Administration did, and then suddenly realizing that they just fired the people who keep our nuclear weapons safe, and then trying to rehire them. But now they've lost the contact information for these ex-employees, and we don't know who they're going to get back. And that sort of DOGE is going through, agency by agency and firing people willy-nilly with obviously no organized plan other than the wholesale dismantling of the sort of federal bureaucracy and administrative state that in 1,000 different ways protects and underpins the foundations of daily life in America.
I'm starting to see some of these impacts hitting red states, which I'm not unhappy about. I think that's where a lot of the pressure has to come. Farmers who were selling food to AID for overseas distribution, guys working in NASA down in Huntsville, Alabama, suddenly learning that they're about to get 21,000 jobs whacked out of Huntsville, a city that employs about 150,000 people overall. That's a real number. But I wonder if you think there's ever a triggering level that starts to change the political calculus. I think Congress, when these programs are getting cut out of their districts, I think there's going to eventually be tacit at first, then louder resistance to it, because this is their deliverable to their people. But I don't know if you think there's a bright line somewhere where the political resistance in Congress or the Senate in particular starts to emerge.
So here's my fear. We've already passed the point of no return in the dismantling of the federal government. That every bit of this is already underway, and we are past the point where even meaningful opposition from Congress would matter. Because, again, Elon Musk is not beholden to any, risk reward, cost benefit analysis in a traditional sense that we are used to working political levers. But more than that, the damage is being done hour by hour and day by day right now. Okay, so 4 to 6 months from now, this battle over the funding freezes, is finally totally clarified, and the federal funding spigot is turned back on. USAID doesn't exist anymore. Though, we have pulled those employees out of all of those countries. We have ended those contracts. The nonprofits that run that work have laid off their staff, and those families are moving out of the countries where they have worked, sometimes for 5, 10, 15 years. The damage has been done on the ground. We saw over the weekend, again, firings at the FAA, an agency where we have all of us riding on our commercial aviation system, and hundreds of those employees have just been cast out because they happened to be, in this first year probationary period. That does not mean, by the way, and I think this is a point worth reiterating for listeners, that those are new employees, that these are not necessarily like 19-year-olds or 22-year-olds coming in. Those are, some of them are mid-career professionals, people who have worked for decades to get to the place where they are. It also counts in the federal structure people who have taken new promotions within agencies that they have worked for years or decades. So if you happen to be in your probationary period for a,
for an SES
exactly, or a GS-15,
sure.
GS-14, you might be getting fired right now, even though you've worked in some of these places for years. Okay, again, let's say the court procedures play out over weeks or months, or Congress really gets worked up and says, we're going to really handle some of these cases in the next set of appropriations starting October 1st. Those people are going to be gone. Those jobs, they're moving on with their lives. That expertise is not coming back. And I think the other thing that really worries me in this is, we know that all of this is going to show up at the Supreme Court in some meaningful way. Which Supreme Court, Rick, shows up to take on that case? And is it the one that hears and rules on the TikTok case in 96 hours? Or is it the one that ruled on the presidential immunity decision and, set the argument for 4 or 5 months from now,
slow-walked it as much as they could.
And then, the ruling takes another 4 or 5 months after that. Does this end up at the Supreme Court and they say, man, this is the most important case that we have to take up, and we're going to do it the first week of our new term in October. And we promise that we will rule by Q2
June of 26.
Q2 26. This damage is done, and every day, every week, every hour that it continues unchecked, this expertise isn't coming back, and these structures are not coming back.
I spoke to someone at a federal agency today, I'm not going to identify which, who said the DOGE person that came in, who was a fresh out of Hillsdale College type, I'm not going to go further identifying, but a very, very young person walked in and said, well, we don't have time to interview everybody about keeping their jobs. So what we've done is they went through every third name on the list, just pure random stochastic terror inside this agency. And it's a pretty important one. But they wanted people gone. And they want to hit Elon's 70% headcount reduction, which is the real goal, which, as you said, destroys the possibility of that expertise ever being retrieved. So, Garrett, I want to go back for a second and talk about Doomsday Scenario for one more minute. Tell folks where they can reach it, where they can get signed up for it, and where they can reach you on social media.
So I am Vermont GMG. Wherever you like to find people on Blue Sky or Instagram or wherever. And then I am, my newsletter is doomsdayscenario.co, doomsdayscenario.co. And it's a 2 to 3 times a week missive, these weekly news roundups from a foreign correspondent, an intrepid, invented foreign correspondent, and some focus on national security. So, in the coming days, writing about Kash Patel and Ukraine, and the general challenge of posed to the governmental structures.
It is a non-trivial, non-joyous moment in our national lifetime. So, Garrett, thank you so much for coming on the show. As always, I appreciate you. We look forward to having you again soon, and best of luck on Doomsday Scenario.
Thank you, sir. Always a pleasure.